Good morning. In this video, I'm going right back to the start. I'm going to have a look at the basics, the fundamentals of what it means to paint in watercolour. If you've never painted in watercolour before and you're new to the medium, then hopefully this will give you some information and some inspiration to get you started. And if you've been painting watercolour for some time, well, I hope you'll stay tuned too, because it always pays to stay quite close to the basics and the fundamentals of whatever it is you're doing. They're there for a reason, and I hope you'll find something perhaps to refresh your knowledge, and there may be something in there that you can use to advance with your watercolour painting. Over the last few weeks and months, I've had considerable number of emails and messages from those of you that follow me on Instagram, those that follow my blog or this YouTube channel. And you've been asking me to put together a tutorial or some tutorials for absolute beginners. And so what I've done is I've created a series of 6 tutorials where we will look at the basic fundamentals of painting in watercolour. We're going to start off today very simply by looking at some of its properties, some of its attributes. What is watercolour? How does it behave? How does it misbehave? We'll then go on to looking at some very, very basic equipment that you need to get started. It's not going to be an exhaustive run through of everything that's on the shop shelf. You can do that yourself, but I will give you a little guide as to what might be a good idea to get started with, because whenever you start a new hobby, it's crazy just to spend a whole load of money on things that ultimately you may decide that you're not going to take forward. We'll then have a look at how to paint a watercolour wash. What does that mean? And there are different ways of doing it. I'm then going to show you how to mix your colours with confidence and to create a palette that will work for the way that you want to paint and the subjects that you might want to paint too. We'll then have a look at watercolour in the context of landscape painting. I'm a landscape painter, and we'll start to have a look at how to use the medium to paint landscapes. It's something, again, that a number of you have mentioned, and it comes up regularly. I'd love to be able to paint landscapes, but I don't really know where to start. It's a difficult subject for me, and it's not something I'm familiar with. I will show you how to use watercolour to paint a simple landscape. And then what we'll do is we'll finish off by looking at how to not just paint a landscape in watercolour, but how to start to give it a little bit of impact. Well, come on, let's get started. So the first thing to say about watercolour, this medium that's much loved by landscape painters and painters of other subjects too, is that it's transparent. Let me show you what I mean. You can see here in my palette this well here that's filled with French ultramarine. It's dark, you can't see through it. But the moment that we mix it with water and put it down on the palette, you can see already the whiteness of the porcelain coming through this gorgeous puddle of transparent, glossy, viscous paint that I've mixed up here. The same thing will be apparent when I transfer this to the paper. See, as I put it down, the white of the paper shines through the wet paint. Now, watercolour's transparency can sometimes be your friend, and at other times it can be your enemy too. It's fantastic for painting delicate scenes where you want to capture subtle variations of light. And it gives watercolours that fresh, transparent look that they're so well known for. The flip side of the coin is that since watercolour is transparent, anything that you paint over can still be seen. Let me demonstrate that for you. I'm painting a square here of yellow ochre paint. I say it's a square. We all know it isn't. We can remember back to our maths classes, I think, and go, actually, do you know what? That isn't a square, Oliver. But hey, never mind. It does the job. Good enough. Now that that's dried, I'm going to paint some French ultramarine over the top of it. It's a darker colour, but let's just see what happens. Here we go. What I'll do is I'll cover half of the shape with the blue and leave the other half unpainted. And you can see quite clearly that the yellow shines through the blue. It's a transparent medium. And you can see the difference between the area here where the yellow is and the white of the paper. We've got a blue and effectively a green and back to blue. And this makes watercolour a wonderful medium to work with. It can be frustrating. It does mean that you have to sometimes plan ahead and think your way around your painting, because you can't just cover up things that you don't like. You can see them. They will shine through what you put over the top of them. But the transparency is something that I love, and it's why I use watercolour, and I find it's just a wonderful medium to work with. And that freshness within the painting, I think, it's unrivaled. You cannot do that with other media. And you can achieve some fantastic effects. One of those is called glazing, where you put thin transparent washes over the top of other areas in your painting. Don't worry about that now. We'll come on to that later, and I will show you a little bit more about that in future videos. But it's a lovely technique, and I use it all the time in my landscape paintings. Now, because watercolour is transparent, it dictates to a certain extent how we paint and approach our paintings. And one of the important principles in watercolour is that, generally speaking, we work from light to dark. And I say that not in terms of colour, but in terms of tone. So don't worry about whether it's yellow, blue, red, or whatever colour. Whatever colour you're using, you start off with the lightest tone and you build those tones up towards the darker passages in your painting. I've got a little exercise to demonstrate that. Have a go at it yourself. See what you make of it. So I'm just going to mix up another wash of yellow ochre. I've got plenty of paint here. It doesn't need to be too dark. And with this cube here, I'm assuming that the light is shining from the top and from this side. In fact, let's just put a little arrow in here to indicate that. So light's coming in from this side and from the top. And it means that the top of this cube is going to be the lightest face. This face here will be slightly darker. And then this face, which is on the other side of the cube, albeit closest to us, is going to be the darkest. Fill your brush with paint and start at the top, working down. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute. Pick up some more paint. Always make sure you're using plenty of paint. This is a basic and a fundamental that I've covered in another video, and I'll put a link to it in the description and a link to it up here in the screen. I say I will, I won't. I'll get my son Tom to do it because he's good at that sort of thing. And it demonstrates the importance of using as much paint as you possibly can, because it contributes to the freshness of your paintings and allows the best attributes of watercolour, one being its transparency, to really shine through. There we are. So that's the cube, all three faces painted. I'm just going to let that dry now. Now I'm going to use the same wash of yellow ochre here. It's got no paint added to it. It's no darker than the wash that I've put here. And I'm going to paint the two faces that will be darker than the top. And you can see just by painting over what is there, I have a stronger tone on these two faces of the cube. Yeah, there's not a great difference, but you can see that by adding another wash of the same colour on top of one that's already there, the tone is increasing in strength. It's becoming darker. Again, I'm going to let that dry and then we'll paint the final face on the cube. So same wash, one face to go. And you can see the tonal value on this face is 3 times as strong as it is on the top. This one twice as much. Because the medium is transparent, we work this way in watercolour. We build up our lights through the mid-ranges to the darks. It's a method of painting and there are some exceptions to it. Again, I can show you those at another time, in particular when we look at glazing, which is putting lighter washes over ones that are already there. But by and large, start light, finish dark. The next important thing to say about watercolour is that it's unpredictable and it can be difficult to control. Have a look at this. If I paint a line of wet paint onto the dry paper, it's pretty easy to control. It stays where I've put it. Of course, if I was to put so much paint on here, bucket loads of it so that it was cascading down the paper, then of course it's going to be difficult to control. But that's not what I'm getting at here. You can see that in terms of me painting any sort of shape really, and I'm just doodling here, but painting a line with plenty of wet paint on the brush, that's not too difficult to control. It's staying where I want it to be. The thing is, though, with watercolour, we often paint into areas that are wet, whether that's an existing wash that's still wet and we're able to run more colours into it, or we'll wet the paper first and paint into that. That's called a wet-on-wet technique. Let me show you that. So I've just wet the paper here. As you can see, it's clear water. It's very wet. And what I'm now going to do is paint a blue stripe into it. Totally different result. The paper's wet. The paint that I've put into it is just going to bleed into that wet area, and it's very hard to predict where it's going to go. You can see it's running down the paper, but it's running down more here than here, and I've got very, very little control over what's going on here. And it all becomes a bit of a mess. Now, the more that this wet area on the paper starts to dry, the more control I have over it, to the point where it becomes dry and we're back to here again. We can exert control over the medium because it's not running everywhere, as water has a habit of doing. If you're looking for a painting medium that is compliant and obedient, I'm afraid watercolour's probably not the one for you. But don't worry about it too much, because this is just another aspect of the medium that we learn how to cope with. We have techniques and strategies, and I'm going to show you tips and techniques that will enable you to bring some control over what you're doing when you're painting in watercolour. But that's for another time. Now, another of watercolour's attributes, and you may have seen this as I was showing you how difficult it can sometimes be to control the paint. But watercolour blends together really, really well. I'm just going to put a wash of French ultramarine on the paper here. Nice and wet, plenty of paint. And right next to it I've got another wash of light red, and I'm just going to let the two collide like that. And you can see all of a sudden that the light red is running into the ultramarine. It's blending together really easily. I'm not having to scrub paint and coax it into place in order to get it to blend. It's just running together. It's the nature of water. That's how water behaves. And I can drop some light red directly into the blue area like that, and you can see it's just running together, and it's creating this rather lovely soft grey. And this is one of my favourite things about watercolour, the ability of the paint just to run and merge together like this, to mix on the paper. It allows you to create wonderfully delicate soft shapes and areas within your painting. And you're probably getting the theme here. There is another flip side to it. That fluidity of the medium can sometimes work against you. And I'll go back to what I was saying about the unpredictability of the paint and how difficult it can sometimes be to control. But you just need to know how to live with it. You need to understand that that's what watercolour does. Don't fight it, work with it, and I will show you the strategies, the techniques that you can use to enable that to happen. Because it is, to me, the most attractive aspect of the medium. Now, what I want to show you next is how watercolour dries. It dries very quickly, unlike oil paints, for example, which can take weeks sometimes to dry. Watercolour dries incredibly quickly, and that can be a huge advantage, particularly when you're working outdoors. But of course, that can work against you. If you're wanting to work wet on wet, like I was here with this area of ultramarine and light red, once it's drying or has completely dried, you can't get these nice blended effects and things start to go wrong. So again, it can work for you, it can work against you. I'll show you how to start to understand the drying process of watercolour. And I just want you to see what happens when I put a wash of yellow ochre down on the paper here. Not only is it going to dry quickly, but you can see at the moment that it's reasonably intense, the colour, and there's plenty of juicy pigment going down onto this or into this area here. Now that this area of yellow ochre has dried, you can see that it is significantly lighter than it was when the paint went down wet. Watercolour dries lighter, and in some cases that can be 30–40% lighter than when you put it down on the paper. It's not a problem, you just have to know about that. You have to allow for it and you have to manage it. What I'm going to do is make an incredibly quick landscape painting and just show you some of these ideas in the context of that. Have a look out for the colours running together. Have a look out for how unpredictable that can be. Some of it I'm just going to exaggerate just so you can get an idea of that. But also have a look at how that unpredictability works for me and how I use it to my advantage. Also have a look out for the ease with which the colours blend and run together. I'm going to start off with a blue wash here for the sky. With watercolour, you tend to start at the top and paint down towards the bottom of your paper because my board is at an angle and it allows the paint to flow down, and I can keep this bead of liquid here in play. Now I'm just going into a slightly warmer colour. It's got some light red mixed into it. It's a grey. And can you see here, it's just merging together. And then in we go into some yellow ochre, and we'll have a nice warm sky as we get down towards horizon here. Now I've got a green wash here, which will be the landscape where it meets the sky, and I'm just dropping that in, allowing it all to run together. I'm going to make some broken marks like this on the paper. That can be some texture in, I don't know, this could be a field. And then I'm going to paint broken shapes down here like this. I don't really know what's happening here. It's just the brush is hitting the paper and making marks, and it's doing what it wants to do, and I'm just guiding it into areas where I want it to run. Now, I'm going to make a deliberate error here, just to show you, of how unpredictable the medium is if you don't know what's going to happen. And I'm going to put some warm clouds into this sky. Now, the problem that I'm going to have is that the sky is too wet, and that the colours that I'm going to paint into it will be too dilute. So I want these clouds to retain some shape, but watch what happens. I've put it in now, and it's not really retaining its shape. It's just sort of run a little bit out of control. I want it to have a nice sort of defined, wispy evening cloud at the bottom of the sky, and that hasn't happened. It's just run everywhere. It's a bit out of control. It's a bit unpredictable. But that's okay. I can work with that. I will just blend it in, allow it to run into the sky, and then I know that I just need to allow this to dry more, so that when I paint into it with more concentrated paint, the clouds will retain some shape. Now, down at the bottom here, this is still wet, and what I want to do is take some quite concentrated colour of, it can be any colour really, but I'm going to put some green in here. And I just want to drop it in and let it run down where the paint is still wet and run up into paint on top of it. It gives a bit more texture, a little bit of modelling, a little bit of shape to the foreground. And it's all running together. It's running where it wants to run to a certain extent, relative to where my brush is, of course. And this is one of the fun things with watercolour. It will start to do what it wants to do, and it's your job really just to manage it to a certain extent. Now, I think the sky is probably going to be dry enough to put in some warm clouds. So I've got a mix here, and I can just run these in, and you can see how they're starting to blend into the sky, but because this is drier and the paint that I'm putting in is more concentrated, they're starting to hold their shape. I don't need too many of these, but it just indicates evening clouds coming across the sky there. So you can see that it's easy to blend colours. None of these shapes have got any hard edges. They have run into the sky, which is still damp, but I'm in control of it because I know how damp this is, and I know how concentrated my paint is. I've learnt that over the years with experience, and so watercolour's ability to blend is something that I'm taking advantage of. Now this is still wet here, so we can continue to just drop more colour into it. And I've got some burnt sienna and some French ultramarine. They mix together really nicely to make wonderful darks, and let's add some in here. I'm just going to test here. It's still slightly damp. But I might put a fence post or something in there because you know that I like fence posts. If you're new to the channel, that's something that you're going to have to get used to, I'm afraid. Fence posts crop up all the time. Yeah, let's put one in now. There it is. Now, you can see that this area here has dried. And so the fence post that I'm putting in is going to hold its shape. I've now got complete control over this. And then I'm just going to let it run down into this area of foreground and grass and whatever it is. We might have another one in here. You can see there it's still damp, so it's starting to just bleed out a bit. I don't mind that, you know, it's okay. And just another one over the hill here. I can then get a small brush and I can put in some areas of foreground grass. Don't get me wrong, this is not a masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm just playing around with the paint so that you can see how it behaves. So when I talk about unpredictability and the ease with which it can blend, these attributes of watercolour, hopefully you can now see what's going on in the context of I say it's a painting with a small p, that's for sure. I'll put some seed heads on the grass, why not? Some more texture here. Some grass in the distance. And, you know, I could go on like this. I could now put a hill in the background here, but I'm not going to, because the purpose of this is just to show you what can be achieved with watercolour very, very simply. And we've had the colours merging and blending together in the sky. That's lovely. I've shown you that by understanding how dry the area that you're working into is, you can control the paint to a certain extent. We put the cloud in first and it all just ran out and you can hardly see it now. Because this dried more and I used a more concentrated mix of paint, these cloud shapes now have managed to hold their shape within that overall wash. Now, while I run the risk of talking about watching paint dry, I have done a video on understanding how paint behaves in more detail and how you can control it. And I've put a link here. A link is in the description to check it out, because that gives you a lot more detail and information on this. So if you want to jump ahead and say, okay, that kind of makes sense, I'd like to know a bit more, well, there's the link and have a look. I think you might find it quite useful. So I hope you found that helpful, and I just want to recap on some of those points for you as a takeaway. Watercolour's properties. It is transparent first and foremost. We saw also that it's unpredictable. It's easy to blend. It dries lighter when you apply it to the paper, and it dries a lot quicker than other media. And despite being a difficult medium to get the hang of, it's accessible. You don't need a lot of equipment to get started. We're going to have a look at that in the next video, and hopefully you will tune in for that, and I'll give you some tips on what to buy and perhaps some things to avoid in order to get you up and running. If you've enjoyed the video, I hope you will click on the thumbs up button just to give it a like. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be fantastic if you're able to do that too. That really helps the channel, and it really helps me to keep making these videos for you. You'll see in the video description that I've put some links there to the equipment that I use. You can click on those and it will take you through to various online retailers that provide that equipment. But I would say this, if you've got a local art shop, go there first. Give support to the smaller retailers, give some support to local businesses, but sometimes they may not have exactly what you're looking for, and then of course, feel free to click through on those links and hopefully they will take you to the right place. If you've got some equipment, why don't you have a go at some of the things that we've looked at in this video? Try them out for yourselves. That is always the best way to learn. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.